Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Open Book Broadcast. I am Allie, the CEO and founder of The Right Place, Right Time, which is my virtual boutique of professional writing services. I am super pumped to be hosting this month's Open Book Broadcast, where we are going to be featuring three of my favorite people / clients / authors. And we're going to be talking about the bravery it takes in saying the difficult things. Now, before I bring on my three fabulous guests, I want to properly introduce them because they are powerhouses of perseverance, resilience, and strength, each and every one of them. I'm excited for them to share their books and their stories with you today, as well as really insightful tidbits on doing the work of telling your story when it is a hard thing to tell. So without further ado, let me introduce our guests. Susan Lynch is the mother of two adult sons in spirit and the author of Life After Kevin, A Mother's Search for Peace and the Golden Retrievers That Led the Way. Susan believes healing after loss is possible, but it requires active participation. She finds purpose in writing and speaking about healing after a loss due to overdose or suicide. And Susan lives with her husband, Tom, their golden retriever, Rune, and a beagle named Ripple. You can often find her with canine buddies exploring the woods of New Hampshire. To learn more, you can go to susanlynch.com. Susan, thanks for being with us today. All right.
Thank you for having me, Allie.
You're so welcome.
It's susan-lynch.com.
Oh, thank you. Yes,
sorry.
You're correct. Of course you are. It's your website. And we'll make sure that we get the correct website into the comments and show notes for people so that you can go and check out Susan and her work.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Sam Heinrich. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist and forthcoming author. Sam loves working with individuals, couples, young adults, and teenagers, and families. As a gay person and as a survivor of childhood clergy sexual abuse, he understands the unique challenges and trauma that life can present to us. Sam's forthcoming memoir, currently titled Though I Walk, not only shares his story, but poignantly illustrates how childhood abuse is a lifetime of abuse. Though I Walk is a call to action to all who read it. We must do something to protect the children of the world. Sam, welcome to today's Open Book Broadcast.
Allie, thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. All right. And Jess Jackson is an influential speaker and writer, is dedicated to intersectional equity and educational content strategy. As the host and author of Sis Your Copper, she developed a self-help wellness framework inspired by her life as a big, biracial, Black queer woman from Detroit, navigating anxiety and depression. Jess is the insightful host of the Art of Impact podcast, founder of Copper House Detroit, and a recognized expert in education and diversity, equity, and inclusion. She holds a BA in sociology and Spanish from the University of Michigan and graduated summa cum laude with her Master's of Education and an MBA. She's the author of a groundbreaking curriculum, Cultivating Racial Equity in the Workplace, and made a lasting impact in the cannabis industry as a former director of social equity and external affairs at the largest cannabis manufacturer in the state. Jess is a trailblazer, community advocate, and board member of multiple nonprofits. Jess, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
I am so excited to have each and every one of you because I know how hard each of you worked during the process of bringing your book all the way to fruition. And I also know, and now everybody else knows based on your bios, that you've all been through some serious shit. I'm just gonna say it as it is. So I was not lying, everyone who's catching this now or later, that these three remarkable people have incredible amounts of resilience, strength, and perseverance to get through the tough stuff of life and to not just get through it for themselves, but to pay it forward with their books by trying to share their stories in order to impact those who read them. So what I would like to do before we dive into how to say the difficult thing and some advice that we can offer to other writers on the path is I'd like to give each of them a chance to talk about their books. A little bit about their story, where can we find those books, and what are they doing with those books now? And so what we're going to do is we're going to start with the most tenured to the most forthcoming. So Susan, your book's been out the longest. So I'm going to tag you in to talk about Life After Kevin.
Thank you, Allie. So my book, Life After Kevin, is a memoir, and it is about the loss of my son to an accidental overdose and moving through that grief with the support of 2 of my golden retrievers and signs from my son in spirit. You can find me at susan-lynch.com. And what I'm doing now is I've been going around to libraries around my state, speaking about healing after loss, and have been giving like some real takeaways for the audience. It is specific to overdose because that's my, slant on grief. But I have what you would call clout, I guess, to say that I've been through two of my sons have passed. And so I think that it gives people hope to know that, they can do things to help facilitate their healing and move forward and live a vibrant life.
And correct me if I'm wrong. Look, I'm going to help you plug yourself.
Mhm.
You've not just gone to libraries, but you've also spoken with like hospice groups and grief groups.
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit about that work using your book.
So I was asked by the hospice organization that I volunteered for to speak about, they had a topic and they were a bunch of speakers, and it was how to, oh geez, I can't even remember it, but I put the slant on it from, again, my experience, to say that what happens when we don't talk about it, because part of my story was that I felt so much shame with my feeling that I had failed as a mom, that I didn't tell anybody how Kevin died for 2 years. So that was really a real block in my healing journey, because I wasn't really able to truly grieve openly about my son. So it was more about how shame and stigma of how a person dies and how that impacts our grief.
Which was definitely one of the things that I learned deeply in our work together. I had never really considered the ways that as a culture and society we say, oh well, how did they die?
Right.
Um we
Yeah.
get this kind of weird sick interest in like the how part, and we stop thinking about like why, like that doesn't even really matter, and what does that question do to the people who are left behind. And did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, it was awful. It was like 98% of the time I'd tell somebody, that my son had died, but they would always follow up with, oh, I'm so sorry. How did he die? And it was like, I felt like they skipped over the fact that my son had died to get to those salacious details. And,
Mhm.
I point out that it happens in obituaries, specifically with, or typically with young people, and they don't put a cause of death in there. And I tell people that is the family's way of saying we're not ready to talk about it. When you have a stigmatized loss like suicide or overdose specifically, there's a lot of trauma around that. There's usually a lot of before the death, and people need to work through that before they're ready to openly share, some of the real trauma that they faced. It wasn't, a long expected illness. It wasn't an illness. I think that sometimes when people don't realize, when if there's cancer or, maybe a long illness like Alzheimer's, or, that gets a lot more sympathy and empathy, whereas overdose and suicide is more of a, well, they did it to themselves kind of thing, and they get a lot less sympathy and empathy. So
Yeah. Well, and I imagine that only then makes, the loved ones who are still with us, the parents especially, only makes them feel more like there was something that they should have done to prevent the death,
right,
right? Because everybody else lacks the empathy around, how this happened, right? Um,
absolutely.
So, okay. And I see Jess and Sam are nodding along with you. And I think definitely both from like their own personal experiences, but especially Sam as a mental health, therapist, I think they resonate with what you're saying. So Susan, we're going to come back to some of the things that you said about the shame and stigma that you were sharing through your story. I want to move over to Jess and let Jess talk a little bit about Sis, Your Copper. This is a beautiful book that came out in September of 23. And so, Jess, why don't you tell us a little bit about your story and the things that you're hoping to do with your book now that it's out there in the world? Jess is in an airport and she's waiting for the announcements to stop so that she can talk.
And I appreciate you sharing your story, Susan, because there's a lot of alignment. My father actually died from a crack overdose. And so I just think about my grandmother and also all of the folks who are affected by mental health. And so that's actually what this is about. I've navigated anxiety and depression for pretty much my entire life. I didn't know how severely anxiety was affecting me until most recently when we don't use this language in mental health therapy anymore, but I seriously had a nervous breakdown. So much anxiety caused my brain to be in a loop that I couldn't stop thinking about suicidal ideation. In fact, I would walk down the hallways of my house and any sharp object I saw, I thought about how I could take my life, or any cord or anything. It's all I could think about. And so I went to a psychiatric ward for 10 days until we figured out what chemicals stabilized my brain. And that's what this book was about. It's about being a Black woman in this world that has been socialized to be the strong Black woman, but navigates a mental illness. I wanted to normalize mental illness as a chemical imbalance, and I developed a framework of balance specifically around 5 key elements. So this is called Sis, Your Copper, and Alchemy to Shine. And the alchemy has 5 key elements: spirituality, so thinking about how you're connected to a larger consciousness and a greater sense of purpose and a sense of divine. Um, the mental and emotional health. How are you going to therapy regularly? How are you medicating? How's your brain doing? The physical wellness. How's your body doing? I've gone through a body transformation of losing 150 pounds, and have incorporated more movement and nutrition into my life, and specifically adornments, and thinking about how I feel in my appearance. It also goes through community and relationships. So how are your networks and your friendships and your partnerships? And then finally closes on capital. So thinking about your professional trajectory. All of those things for me in my life have affected my mental health severely, whether it be job loss or losing my father, or navigating a mother who has a post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis and an anxiety diagnosis, and a father who had a substance abuse disorder, right? Navigating the church and how they shamed me for being queer, and not finding my sense of belonging in a world as a woman of color who's biracial and has a white mother and a Black father. So I start each chapter with shit shows. And then we work through some cognitive behavioral therapy practices to reframe those shit shows and talk through how I learned it, so that folks can normalize their own shit shows, and destigmatize and remove the shame of their life experiences. And then I close out with some practices, or with things that I call copper moments, to help folks reach their own balance. And so it's a self-help memoir with the goal of reaching women of color who are taught to be the strong Black woman, when Black women have the highest and fastest growing rates of suicide in this country. Yes, white men make up the most of people who are committing suicide, but that's because they're the larger population. But Black women are not. There's a gap in mental health resources that are targeted towards us. Most of the research is on white folks. And so I want to normalize for my sis that mental health is a real determinant of your life. And it's okay if you need to get meds to stabilize your mental chemistry, or if you need to to incorporate different forms of movement so that you can somatically move through trauma. And that has been my goal. And some of the ways that I've been reaching audiences is by just sharing my story publicly online. So I have a YouTube channel. And then my big aspiration is to speak on colleges and universities, because that's when I had my first major depressive episode, was when I was on college and was sexually traumatized. So there's also some stories of sexual trauma in my book, and navigating that. And yeah, so that's what I've been up to, and that's what we're sharing in Sis Your Copper. And I've essentially turned my shit shows into a holistic wellness framework to help my sis navigate and destigmatize her own moments of imbalance and trauma.
So Jess, there's something that I want you to highlight for people that are watching this, which is that you are offering this framework, but there are two things I think that are really important about your book that separate it. Number one, you're very much about the reader having their own agency over their story and over their life. And two, you're also very clear in your book that while you're offering a framework, some things to help with their mental illness or their chemical imbalance, you are not suggesting that these 5 things together get rid of or cure. Do you want to talk to those two things?
Yeah, absolutely. So my book opens with a scene before I quit my job and moved to Brazil for a 6-week sabbatical. And I went to Brazil as a way to flee what was going on in my emotions. And when I was there, it was beautiful. I love Brazil. It's my favorite place in the world. I wanna retire there. But I was depressed for 2 weeks while I was there. And so the realization that, like, my brain is my brain, and my brain chemistry and my trauma responses, they're not going anywhere. I've dealt with suicidal ideation and depression since I was 16. And so these are things that are not going to change, but I had to learn to accept myself. So on the cover of my book, it's me in a mirror looking at myself, because the real thing is to just accept how your brain is, so that you can treat it with all different types of practices. And you don't have to do, and that's my other mantra, is you don't have to do anything that I've done, but I'm sharing my story so that maybe you can try. Because I was too scared to go to therapy and get a diagnosis for most of my life. I was too scared to start meds. And so I just want to normalize any form of treatment, any form of care, and to prioritize self-love for folks.
Thank you. Thank you for making that distinction, just so that we've got our audience is really clear that you are not suggesting that you've got some sort of magic pill that will make everything go away, but you have some really practical things for them to be thinking about to hopefully help carry that weight. And last but certainly not least, Sam. So Sam, your book, Though I Walk, comes out this June. Tell us a little bit about your story and what you're hoping your book will do once it's out in the world.
Yeah. So in 2015, 2016, I was experiencing extreme anxiety and depression, and I couldn't really figure out why. I had been in traditional talk therapy for a period of a year and was really seeing no change. Was also on some medication and just was not seeing any change that I wanted to. And basically got to the point where I could no longer work. And so I attempted, or I used an alternative therapy, MDMA, which I went through and through the sessions with that. And through those sessions, I recovered memories of being sexually abused as a child by the Catholic priest at the school that I attended, at the grade school I attended. And so it's really about my progress through those different sessions of recovered memories, and then also how I went about processing those experiences, which, as the book says, though I walked, there were periods of days that I would walk 12 miles in a day. It was the anxiety in my body was so great. It was the only way that I could reduce it. And so through that process, I thought I had gone from being a victim to really becoming a survivor. But there was a process where I had went and sued the diocese of the Catholic Church that I was attending school in. And through that process, opened up all of those wounds again at a different level, totally at a different level. And so I went through that process, and then decided afterwards, because I settled out of court, and the priest was never named as a person of being a perpetrator. And so part of my healing is I felt like I didn't have a voice through that process. And so I decided to write a book, which through that adventure of writing the book opened all of that stuff again at another level. So continue to walk. In fact, to this day, I still walk 4 to 6 miles a day, just as a way to keep my anxiety down. And I really see that as therapeutic. That works much better for me than sitting in an office talking to somebody, is just being out there in my own thoughts and being able to process all of my feelings. But through that process, part of telling my story was the shame of just the sexual abuse that had happened. There was this period I went through as, why couldn't I remember any of this that happened? It also made a lot of sense after I found out the reasons why I did certain things in my life, the reasons why I made certain decisions in my life. But there was shame around that whole process. And even today, when I talk to people about writing a book, everybody seems to be very excited about the process of me writing the book until they ask the question, what's your story about? And as I start to talk about childhood sexual abuse, the Catholic Church, those things, I can just see kind of a wall be built up in front of these people. It's just subjects that they don't really want to talk about. It's tabooed subjects. And yet, part of the reason why I wrote the book is for people to realize that it is okay to talk about that. And also, my book is focused much more towards anybody that has been sexually abused, because I think the process of sexual abuse, no matter who the perpetrator is definitely has similarities. But I was writing it basically towards men, because through my own process, as I went to look for resources for myself, at one point there was, I just want to know somebody else, another man that has been sexually abused. And as I went to look for resources, most of the resources were geared towards females. And so I was lucky enough to eventually find a writing group and a men's group that I attended. And it was kind of through the writing group that I decided to really write my story and put it out there. So it's geared really towards anybody that's been sexually abused, but really towards men. And there's some resources in the book.
Thanks, Sam. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for sharing pieces of yourselves. While it was very specific that I invited the three of you, I had even forgotten how many different overlaps there were between the three of your books and themes. So I hope that you find community just in each other today, and realizing how many similarities, the three of you have been through in various capacities. So let's move and talk a little bit about the writing process, and how the writing process has a way of both digging up all of the stuff, right? While also working towards healing some of that stuff. I feel like it's a kind of it's a double-edged thing, right? It kind of scrapes that scab off again, while at the same time kind of revealing new skin underneath. So let's go kind of in reverse order this time, I guess. Sam, you mentioned when you were just sharing that, writing the book was digging it all up again. Where do you feel like you ended up, though, by the time you were done? Can you walk us through your experience of kind of start to finish? I mean, not a lot of the details, but what was the transformation you felt that you went on as a person?
Yeah, definitely. I believe there's two names to call somebody that's been sexually abused. I believe that you can be called a victim, which I think happens shortly after the abuse has happened until you start to process it. And then you can also be called the survivor. And so I felt like what happened to me at 57 years of age is when I recovered these memories was that I almost went back to being the victim at that point because it was my first reality of the abuse that had happened. So I think, until I decided to write the book, it was a process of really going from victim to survivor. And through that process, I thought that I had got to the point that I was a real survivor. But what I realized when I started to write the book was, as you said, Allie, the wound was the scab was scraped open, and at times it almost felt like it was dug into, going back into all of the things that had happened. The thing of it is that I didn't have a voice up until I started to write the book. I had memories and I had the processing, but it was through writing the book that I really gained the voice and took back my power in regards to, if the Catholic Church does not want to name the priest that sexually abused me, then I will do it on my own and I will write a book and put it out there.
Yeah, I love that. I wanna kind of like verbally underline underline that for people who come back and watch this episode. That writing a book and telling your story gives you your voice back and helps with giving you your power back in the process. And I mean, what else could we possibly say that could be more valuable to us than our own personal power, right? And when that is stripped from us from a variety of perspectives, whether that's systemic oppression or that's, a perpetrator, right? When we can gain some semblance of that power back, it is a total game changer. So thank you, Sam, for sharing that. Jess, what about your transformation? How did you feel? Where did you begin when you were with the book? And then by the time you ended the book, where did you feel like you landed?
Yeah, so I'd always owned my agency in telling my own story because as a Black woman, the world they don't care about me. They're not gonna write my story for me, and so I knew that I had to document my own life. How does this sound? Is it too distracting?
Why don't you hold your thought? Oh, wait, it just stopped. Keep
Okay,
going.
yeah. So I wanted to make sure that I documented my life because my life matters. But specifically, I wanted to make sure because my biggest fear is that I'm going to die by suicide. Um, I've had 2 attempts in my life. My trauma response and coping mechanism is suicidal ideation. I have anxiety. So these are things that I wanted to make sure that my life had more meaning beyond life than just my suicide. And so I'm not planning on death by suicide, but that is one of my fears. And so I wanted to write that. And then after I wrote the book for a year, I applied the copper alchemy to my own life, and I was able to see how, and even my most recent episode. I went through an assessment. I created a self-care assessment. Actually, that's on my website, justhuman.com. And if you click in the right-hand corner, there's a button that says download a free resource or something like that. And I went through and evaluated where I was in my self-care practices. And my self-care around mental and emotional balance was completely off. My physical wellness was way high. I was working out all the time. I was doing all the things, but I was not prioritizing my mental health. And so I constantly go back to it now and use it as kind of an assessment to see where I'm at and what do I need. And that has been transformational for me, and recognizing that I created something that's not only useful for me, but also my mother. I wrote about my mom's sexual abuse in her bio in my first chapter. And when she read the book, she was actually very disappointed that I shared her story. But her story intersected with mine because it affected the way she raised her daughters, right? Her fear and her sexual trauma affected the way she raised her daughters. And my mom is of a different generation, and sexual trauma was not for her. She did not learn that she was a victim. She did not learn that this was something that was not her fault. She was shamed for it, sent away to go live with her grandparents. And so when she read my book, it prompted her to seek therapy around that. And so now it healed our relationship. It actually has made her recognize how some of her trauma affected her parenting and pretty much her entire life. She's unpacked that scenario in therapy that she had not for over 40 years. She'd been dealing with that suppressed trauma. And so she's been working through that. And that's how it's kind of transformed not only myself, but my relationships and my family.
I love that. I love that because it speaks to the personal, and it also kind of speaks to the political in a lot of ways, right? Because we know that if it's impacting your mom, it's impacting other people who are reading it, right? Um, and that's what we want our books to do. We want them to transcend from being about us to being about others. I think Sam, you had said it best once recently as we were winding down and getting the book ready to hand over. You said that you were finally ready for your story no longer to be just yours, which was a super powerful statement. That alone had kind of shown your own transformation from where you were when we began the work on a mission just to name the perpetrator, to a place where you were like, no, I'm ready to kind of offer it to the world and have it like take on its own breath and life and go out and like do the work that it needs to do. Susan, what about you? Where, when we began the work with your book, where do you feel like you were emotionally with the storytelling and that, and then where do you feel like you ended up? And of course, I know, not everybody else knows, I know how much processing you had already done by the time we actually started working on the book, but
Yeah.
what's your take?
Yeah, I had done a lot of, I had made my grief my job. So I had done a lot of the processing. When I came to you, I was really frustrated in that everybody knew the end of the story and there was just the judgment around how Kevin died. And it was really important for me to give the whole story. So people knew how he lived, who he was as a person and not just how he died. And I think that when we talk about overdose, we usually hear it, as a statistic or a number. And I wanted to really give the human part of it and give people the whole picture so they can, and I think that the more we talk about it, it helps break down the stigma. So I felt really strongly that I wanted to give that whole, the whole picture of Kevin's life. And I was nervous because I wanted to make sure I did a really good job and honor him honestly. I mean, I didn't hold anything back with like the, this the stuff that he went through too, but it was yeah, it was the whole picture. And I felt like by the end of it, I was super, super proud and super happy that I finally got it all out. When people say, I don't know how you did it. And I could just go, here, this is how I did it.
Well, I think what's really interesting is from my perspective, watching you go through the process, by the time that you were done, I think that you realized how much more there was to say. Like, you
Yeah.
had captured Kevin on the page for sure and honored his life and provided a real life story to somebody who had died by overdose so that he wouldn't be a statistic. But I also think by the time you got done, you recognized how much more there was for you to go and talk about, like to take the book to libraries, to take the book to hospice places, to talk about overdose more openly. I think, like, yes, to some extent there was like a focus on like gonna tell Kevin's story, but by the time you got to the end, you realized that this is like, well, this is not just about Kevin, right? Like, this is about the world of us who are experiencing this kind of grief
Yeah.
from these ways. Um,
Definitely.
so let's talk about something that you just said. You just said, the more that we talk about the stigmatized things, the less stigmatized they are, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is some advice you would give to a writer who has a heavy hitter, I'm going to call it, of life experience that they want to talk about, but that stigma and shame piece is just standing in their way? Like, I want to hear from each of you, but Susan, you go first. How would you tell them to dig in? How would you tell them to face that?
So I'll start with the end. So after I wrote my book, and it was out, and I had people writing to me and telling me, thank you so much for sharing this. Our family went through the same thing. And that, just hearing that helps me in because I think of healing as like a continuous process, right? It's not a destination we get to, it is an active process. And so when somebody says that to me, that helps me in my healing. And I would say that your book can be the thing that might help somebody else feel seen, less alone, heard, and maybe it's the catalyst that helps them say, okay, maybe I need to face some things, or get them into therapy or a grief group, or talk to people about it. So, I mean, it can do so much good for the world, people in the world, but it also does a lot for the author, as as just getting that feedback from people.
Yeah. So it almost sounds like people need to trust that it could be painful. It might be painful at the beginning or in the process, but the benefits are going to outweigh the costs, like on the other side.
Absolutely. So I'll give you another example. So my other son died by suicide um, in December. And I came right out with how he died, and even spoke to it at the funeral. And I can't tell you how many people have either come up to me in person, written to me, called me, and just said, thank you so much for coming right out and talking about it, and being brave to say it, because it just helps I shouldn't say normalize, that's not the right word, but it helps it be less taboo, right? To be able to talk about it, because when you are going through shame needs secrecy to thrive. And it's so isolating and lonely to go through it by yourself. So yeah, it's been really validating and healing to be able to come right out and say it, whereas before, when Kevin died, it was 2 years it took me to get to that point.
Well, I mean, definitely, I think that we learn from our prior experiences, right? Like, and how to traverse things differently the next time something similar happens, even if it's not exactly the same. But the other thing too, I think, is that's important about what you said, Susan, is a lot of people with memoir get really trapped in the fear of like, nobody will like what I have to say, everybody will hate it, they're going to judge me for my experiences. And what I've seen to be true, and you were all examples of this, is when the book comes out, the story gets said and told and shared, people come by the droves to say, this mattered to me. I needed to hear this. This is exactly how I feel about X. You inspired me to do Y. I hear that more often than people coming out of the woodwork to be like, your book sucked and it didn't mean anything to me, right? But as a first-time memoirist, we are so attached to all of the horrible feelings that we've had about the experience before, that the idea to then write about them, like, we can only see on the other side people not liking it, rather than seeing that people need it, not even like might like it or might be entertained by it or enjoy it, but like actually need it for where they're at, in the journey. And I think that's something that should be written down on a post-it, and like on top of the computer every time somebody sits down to write. Thank you, Susan, for sharing. Jess, what would you say is like the thing you would want an aspiring, writer, memoirist to know when they're trying to get the shame and stigma pieces out onto the page?
Well, the antidote to shame is vulnerability. So by sharing, you'll be able to move through that shame. But the key is self-acceptance. When you decide to put your story or any narrative or any piece of work out publicly, you are opening yourself up to judgment, speculation, and other people's perspective of you, no matter what. And so when you do that, you could have mostly positive feedback, but you also might have someone who doesn't resonate with your story or the way that you named something or something that you said. And you have to accept yourself. So, and practice that with the mantra. Talk about it. Talk about how you accept who you are no matter what. I got good experience being on some pretty viral podcasts. And and it was a conservative leaning podcast, and I'm a queer radical woman of color. Um, and I got a lot of pushback. I got a lot of folks giving me negative commentary. I got a lot of people shaming me. And I had to like walk in my truth and say, I accept myself. I accept myself. I accept who I am. I accept the destiny God has given me to walk. And I just affirm that and recognize that no matter what anybody else says about me, I have to accept who I am. And when you accept that, it's not that difficult to be vulnerable. It's not that difficult to show up for the folks who need your message and need your story.
I love that. I accept myself. I accept myself. And what I want to do is I want to let people know that a big piece of writing, whether you understand it or not, is going to be your mindset and your self-care. Writing is like 1/3 of the equation, and another third is like taking care of your ass. Okay. You have got to put in some places for deep breath work or walks like Sam, or some baths or some rituals, some mantras, as Jess has suggested. Um, walks in the woods with your dogs, whatever it is, like you've got to build that in while you're working on this work, because it's deep and it's hard and it's challenging. It's ultimately rewarding and empowering and liberating. But you're not going to get there if you don't have those self-care pieces in place. Sam, I want to hear from you. What advice would you give to the aspiring writer when they're dealing with shame and stigma?
Well, I agree with everything that's been said by Susan and Jess and yourself. I think really having yourself get to a point that you're accepting of what has happened in your life, and that you build a real strong support system around yourself as you go through the writing. Because as I said earlier, it kind of opens it up again. And so, having a strong support system and then some way of self-care, which mine was walking. Um, and I think really having a strong belief, as everybody said, that this book is going to be helpful to others. I've said to Allie all along, if it just helps one person, it's worth the story that I've written. Hopefully my book will help more than one person. But if it's just one person who can say, oh, I know somebody else that's been through this, I think it's totally worth it.
Well, yeah, I mean, Sam, you shared earlier that like you just wanted one other man that you knew along your healing path, right? You just wanted to know one other man who had been through this so that you could feel less alone, right? That would have meant the world to you. Yep. So if our books go out and they get to that one person, inevitably they've got the ripple effect. And Susan, you talk about ripple effect in your book, but inevitably the ripple effect is cast. But we just need to reach the one, because we know that like we were the one at one point looking to somebody else's book and needing it and resonating with it. And so support system, I think, is a really great point, Sam. And I think that that's not just, friends or family or partners, but support on the writing journey. It's a very isolating road to be trying to write these very difficult things that you've been through, kind of holed up in a room somewhere on your own. Especially when you've already got more thoughts than you could possibly process. All right. And you're trying to figure out what goes onto the page and what doesn't. And as Susan had said, right, secrecy and silence kind of like only breed shame more. And Jess mentioned, right, the way to get over it is through vulnerability. I can think of nothing better than to be working with somebody on the writing and publishing path as you're developing the manuscript. Because you've got at least one devoted person that's on the path with you. You've got one person you got to say all the things to, which is the vulnerability. It's the saying it out loud. It's the making it less stigmatized and shameful because you've got somebody else there with you who's hearing and seeing you. And the more that you say it to that person, the braver you become to say it to the others who are going to eventually get it on the other side. So that's my little plug for working with coaches, working with ghostwriters, working with consultants, not necessarily me. I mean, I'm the bomb. I think they would all agree, but it's finding the right person for you on the journey to make it as possible as it can be for you to do the incredibly difficult work of saying your story, but the also incredibly powerful work of saying your story. So we're going to wrap up by allowing each of our guests to kind of say what they've got out there, what's coming up for them. I'm going to actually let Jess go first because she's in the airport. I have no idea when she's got to get to her gate. So Jess, why don't you tell us a little bit about where people can connect with you and what you've got coming up?
Yeah, you can connect with me on Instagram at I am just human, or my website justhuman.com. And I have a podcast, The Art of Impact, which launches March 13th. And that link to The Art of Impact is theartofimpact.co. That is also linked in my bio in my Instagram. It's also linked on my website. And then I also have a YouTube channel called Sister Copper where I read, and I will be launching a book club, which will be a mental health and emotional support group. And I'm going to call it a pity party because I think that we don't hold space enough for our feelings. I think people are too uncomfortable with negative emotions. And so I want to hold space for us. If it means we're just going to sit there for 30 minutes and cry to get through that, I think that we need to do that with each other. So if you're interested in those things, be sure to sign up for my mailing list. I also have those self-care practices. There's over 60 on that list in that self-assessment. I call it my vision board activity because it helps you to evaluate where you are and where you should set some goals. Go ahead and check that out on my website.
Beautiful. So much great stuff. Thanks, Jess. All right. Susan, do you want to talk about, well, I know we got to get your Susan-Lynch.com. So
Yes.
we put that up on a banner here. All right. Tell us a couple of things that might be over there for people when they go to visit the website.
Yeah, you can get more information on my book, Life After Kevin. You can see my journey in dogs and find out how to book me for a speaking engagement on healing after loss. I am going to be revamping my talk because I want to be able to include my son, Matthew, as well as Kevin, and it will be more focused on stigmatized grief of overdose and suicide and how things you can do to help yourself in your healing process. So there's definitely takeaways for anyone in grief, but specifically if you're looking at a stigmatized loss, it will be focused on that. I have a free download you can get. It's called 10 Ways of Navigating Grief According to Life After Kevin, which has things that I've learned and specific passages from the book. So check that out.
Beautiful stuff. Thank you, Susan, for all the work you're doing in this space.
Thank you.
And Sam, where should people come and kind of connect with you? The book's not out yet, so where would you like people to kind of come and see what you're up to?
I think, as you said, I'm just starting kind of the process of the publishing. And so at this point, I think they can find me on LinkedIn. And I have an email address of samheinrichauthor@yahoo.com or at gmail.com, excuse me.
I'll put that in the banner here. Okay. And then, of course, we also want to let people know that Sam does have a GoFundMe running for the book. So you can still donate to that campaign to help Sam cover publishing costs. So again, the links look really yucky in all of these banners, but I will have links to everybody's things in show notes or comments following the live stream. So I just want to thank each and every one of you again for being with me today. It's always so powerful to hear each of you speak about your experiences and your journeys. I love your books. They're beautiful. They're just, everybody needs a copy of every single one of them because there's something to be gained no matter if you share in the experiences that you've all had. I've been changed by the work with you and the books that you have, and I know that others are every day that they're grabbing a copy. So I'm wishing you each so much success in selling those books and getting them out there into the world, in talks and podcasts, in all the things. And everyone, we're going to be back again. Let's see. Yes, Luella, Bitly could shorten the links. We'll get on that the next time, for sure. And join me again next month. We will be live with a few more guests on April 9th. And we're going to have guests talking about doing the brave thing of writing a book when you've never written a book before. So join me again then. And Sam, Jess, Susan, thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Allie.